Hey guys, welcome back to Myra Stories. Now I know we've explored some pretty wild courtroom showdowns before, but today's story, it starts in the Supreme Court chambers and ends with Denzel Washington doing something that left even Chief Justice John Roberts stunned into silence. It began with a buzz, not from a political insider or a legal scholar, but from a Hollywood A-lister walking straight into the highest court in the United States like he belonged there. And here's the wild part. He kind of did. Denzel Washington had always been more than just an actor. Known for portraying powerful, principled men in courtrooms and war zones, what many didn't know was that he had a real-life obsession with law, particularly constitutional law. He'd audited courses at Georgetown and Yale. He'd spent years studying Supreme Court rulings, not for a role, but for personal conviction. So when a high-profile civil forfeiture case came to the docket, one that threatened to further erode citizens' property rights, Denzel didn't just take notice. He filed an amicus curiae brief. At first, Chief Justice John Roberts thought it was a joke. Denzel Washington, really? Hollywood had no place in the sanctum of constitutional interpretation, and Roberts, always the traditionalist, let his irritation show. During a private pre-hearing briefing, a staff clerk shared something that caught the Chief Justice off guard. "Sir, you might want to actually read what he wrote." Roberts rolled his eyes, but he skimmed it. Then he read it again. Then he read the sources. And slowly his confidence began to flicker. Because Denzel wasn't just quoting precedent, he was challenging Roberts' own past interpretations with surgical precision. Still, when the day of the hearing came, and Denzel asked to present a 5-minute oral argument in support of the petitioner, a retired Army sergeant whose home and car were seized without charges, the skepticism in the room was palpable. Roberts agreed reluctantly. There was a smugness in his tone. The press was watching. Let the actor play lawyer. It would be over quickly. But then Denzel stood. No suit, no briefcase, just a small notebook and a commanding presence that silenced the rustling gallery in seconds. His voice was calm but firm. "Your Honors, I'm not here today as an actor. I'm here as a citizen, as someone who believes in the promise of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, not just in the letter, but in the spirit of our Constitution." And then he launched into one of the most persuasive, emotional, and technically sound 5-minute speeches ever heard in those chambers. He cited Timms versus Indiana, Bennis versus Michigan, even contrasting them with Boyd versus United States, all without looking at notes. He made eye contact with every justice, including Roberts. And just like that, the air changed. What began as a celebrity stunt had morphed into a moment of reckoning. Even the clerks were whispering. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward. Justice Kagan smiled, just slightly. As Denzel walked back to the visitor bench, there was silence. Then Chief Justice Roberts adjusted his glasses and said something no one expected. "Mr. Washington, I may have underestimated you." But this was only the beginning, because what came next would spark a debate so fierce, so uncomfortable for the establishment, it would reach into the very heart of American property law. And Denzel wasn't done yet. There's a reason Denzel Washington chose this case to walk into the Supreme Court. It wasn't about media attention. It wasn't about ego. It was about Master Sergeant Caleb Reeves, a decorated veteran who had spent 28 years serving his country, only to have his house, car, and life savings seized by the very government he fought to protect. And here's where things get real. Reeves wasn't a criminal, not even close. He wasn't accused, indicted, or even questioned in relation to any crime. His only mistake? Lending his nephew his pickup truck, a nephew who was later caught transporting stolen goods. Even though Reeves had no knowledge of it, local authorities seized his truck under civil asset forfeiture laws. Then, shockingly, they went after more. Within a week, Reeves' bank accounts were frozen. His home, paid off with a veteran's pension, was raided for evidence. Nothing was found, but the property stayed in custody. Legally, they didn't need a conviction, just suspicion. And Reeves? He had no money left to fight it. This is where Denzel stepped in. Through an old friend, a JAG lawyer turned activist. Denzel learned about Reeves' situation. He was appalled. The man had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Panama. He had a bronze star, a purple heart, and a spotless record. And now he was sleeping on a cot in a church basement because the system he defended had turned against him. Denzel met Reeves in person. He listened to every word. He asked questions, took notes, and when he left, he didn't shake hands. He made a promise. I'm going to make sure they hear your voice in the highest court of this land. Back in D.C., Denzel worked the phones, lawyers, professors, advocacy groups. He didn't care how long it took. Within months, with help from the Institute for Justice and a constitutional law professor from NYU, they filed a petition to be heard by the Supreme Court. Not just as a case, but as a statement about how civil forfeiture had gone too far. To everyone's surprise, the court granted certiorari. And that's how, months later, Denzel Washington walked into the chamber, not as a guest but as an advocate, fighting for a man most of the country had never heard of. But Chief Justice Roberts? He still wasn't sold. Not on Denzel, and definitely not on Reeves's claim. In his mind, civil forfeiture was a tool. Imperfect maybe, but necessary. And while Denzel's opening remarks had shaken his confidence, the real test would come next. Because the justices didn't just want emotion, they wanted precedent, they wanted technicality, they wanted clarity, and Denzel was ready for all of it. Behind him, Caleb Reeves sat quietly in a borrowed jacket, hands folded, eyes fixed on the bench. And for the first time in years, he felt hope. The room was still. The next speaker approached the podium, but the justices were still looking at Denzel. Because what they had just witnessed didn't feel like the end of a cameo. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. Chief Justice John Roberts wasn't easily impressed. He listened politely, even acknowledged quietly that Denzel Washington had presented his argument with an eloquence and restraint that felt anything but performative. But Roberts was, above all, a guardian of legal tradition, and today he was drawing a line. The court recessed for lunch, but Roberts didn't leave his seat immediately. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed, thinking. He had studied this case more carefully than he wanted to admit. The civil forfeiture laws had been challenged before and survived. Why was this different? What troubled him wasn't Denzel's celebrity. It was his competence. The way he cited Austin vs. United States in United States vs. Baja Kajian, not just referencing the cases, but contextualizing them with a moral clarity most seasoned lawyers struggled to match. And then there was the troubling detail. The government had seized Sergeant Caleb Reeves's property without charging him with a crime. Legally sound? Maybe, but ethically? Roberts wasn't sure anymore. Later that day, during a closed-door conference, the justices began informal deliberations. Roberts, ever the tactician, played devil's advocate. What precedent, he asked, do we risk setting by invalidating a tool used for decades to dismantle criminal enterprises? Justice Sotomayor leaned forward. What precedent do we reinforce by allowing the government to take from citizens without due process? Silence. Then Justice Kagan chimed in. What Denzel is arguing isn't the elimination of civil forfeiture. It's reform. It's constitutional accountability. Roberts tapped his pen, weighing every word. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, the media was beginning to stir. Word had leaked that Denzel Washington wasn't just observing this trial, he was leading a legal team. Pundits speculated wildly. Was he eyeing a political move? Was this a PR stunt? They had no idea that in the back rooms of the courthouse, Roberts had just called his senior clerk and said quietly, I want every brief Denzel's team submitted. Full analysis, and I want it tonight. Because even if Roberts didn't like what this case represented, he couldn't deny what he felt. Denzel wasn't here for headlines. He was here for justice. And for the first time, Roberts wondered if maybe, just maybe, the system needed this shakeup. In a private hallway, Denzel sat with Sergeant Reeves, sharing a quiet moment over coffee from a courthouse vending machine. Reeves said, You think they'll listen? Denzel looked him in the eye. They're already listening? Now we make them decide. And just down the hall, Chief Justice Roberts began drafting his opinion framework, just in case the court did something it hadn't done in a long time. Change. The courtroom was packed tighter than it had been all week. Word had officially gotten out, not just that Denzel Washington was representing the defense, but that his team had petitioned for a rare procedural allowance, a live cross-examination of the federal officer responsible for seizing Sergeant Reeves's property. It was bold, almost unheard of in a case at this level. Chief Justice Roberts approved it, reluctantly. This had better not turn into theater, he warned. It didn't. It turned into a masterclass. The witness was Special Agent Thomas Garrity, a veteran of the DEA, sharp, confident, clearly briefed for this exact moment. Denzel didn't try to intimidate him. Instead, he walked slowly to the podium, paused, and asked in a calm, even tone, "Agent Garrity, can you tell the court what crime Sergeant Caleb Reeves was charged with?" Garrity hesitated. He wasn't charged. The evidence was suggestive of involvement. Suggestive? Denzel raised an eyebrow. Would you seize someone's house based on suggestion, Agent Garrity? Under civil forfeiture law, Garrity replied tightly, we can act on probable cause. Denzel nodded. Right. So let's talk about that cause. What was it? A large amount of cash, no receipts, and a tip from a confidential informant. Cash in a safe in his own home, Denzel said. And the tip? Uncorroborated? Yes. And how long have you been with the agency? 15 years. Denzel stepped forward, voice still calm but cutting deeper. And in 15 years, how many times have you had to return property to citizens who turned out to be innocent? Silence. Twice, Garrity finally said. And in how many of those cases did the agency offer an apology? Garrity blinked. We don't apologize, Mr. Washington. That's not part of the process. The courtroom was dead quiet. Even the justices were still, because Denzel had just laid bare the heart of the issue, not in outrage but with surgical precision. There is no accountability. He turned to the bench. Your Honors, I'm not saying we shouldn't investigate criminal activity. I'm saying we cannot allow government power to trample constitutional rights just because it's easier. Justice Roberts was staring at him, no longer skeptical, just deeply unsettled, because in that moment it was clear to everyone. This wasn't Denzel Washington, the actor. This was a man who had done the reading, who had walked into the lion's den, and who, and against all odds, was winning. And it wasn't because he was famous. It was because he was right. Outside, news vans lined the block. Social media exploded with clips of the hearing. Hashtags trended worldwide. Shaka Denzel, the system, Shaka justice for Reeves, Sanj Roberts is watching. And inside the chamber for the first time in years, the Supreme Court was doing more than just interpreting law. It was feeling the weight of it. The tension in the Supreme Court chamber didn't fade after Denzel's cross-examination. It grew heavier. The silence following Agent Garrity's testimony lingered like smoke. People weren't just paying attention now. They were leaning in, breath held. Chief Justice Roberts recessed for the day early. He didn't say why, but those who had watched him for years knew something was shifting behind those sharp blue eyes. Something had gotten under his skin. And Denzel? He didn't celebrate. He didn't even speak to reporters. He simply walked out of the building, head down, coat collar up, as if he hadn't just delivered the legal equivalent of a knockout punch in front of the nation's highest judges. But what no one knew, not yet, was that inside the chambers, after the room cleared, something very rare had happened. Roberts called a private meeting with the clerks. He ordered transcripts of past civil forfeiture cases, dozens of them, then locked himself in his chambers for hours. And late that night, when only security guards remained, he whispered to himself as he flipped through pages of court history. How many times have we gotten this wrong? It was a question that carried weight, not just because of who asked it, but because of why he was asking it now. Meanwhile, outside the marble walls of justice, the story was spreading like wildfire. Talk shows were buzzing. Cable news played clips from the hearing on loop. And most notably, former Supreme Court clerks began appearing on air, admitting that Washington's arguments weren't just powerful, they were legally airtight. He hit a blind spot, one analyst confessed. We've let agencies act like judge and jury for years, and it took Denzel Washington to make us see it. Back at Denzel's hotel, a letter was waiting for him at the front desk. No stamp, no envelope, just a single folded page with a typed message. It read, "You shook something loose today. Be careful who notices. Not everyone wants this system questioned." No signature, no trace. And that's when Denzel realized this wasn't just about Sergeant Reeves anymore. It wasn't even about civil forfeiture. It was about the entire framework of unchecked authority. He had opened a door, and whatever was behind it was watching him now. The next morning, Washington, D.C. felt colder. Not the weather, the air, the mood. Something intangible had shifted. Denzel Washington, usually calm and composed, woke up early and sat by the window of his hotel room, scanning the street below. Black sedans passed by like they always did, but now every one of them felt like it might be watching. He wasn't being paranoid. Not after that note. Not after the way Roberts had stared at him. Not with anger, but with something closer to respect and concern. That kind of gaze had consequences. Meanwhile, at the Supreme Court building, Chief Justice Roberts arrived alone. No aides, no conversation, just him, his thoughts, and a leather binder under his arm. Inside it, historical rulings, legal memos, and one handwritten note titled Re-Evaluation, Authority and Accountability. Behind closed doors, he wasn't asking whether Denzel was right. He was asking how they had let it get this far. Back at the courthouse, as Denzel entered through the side entrance, away from the growing press, he was met by a woman waiting quietly by the elevator. She looked like she didn't belong there. Civilian clothes, no briefcase, no press badge. "Mr. Washington," she said quietly, "you don't know me, but I used to work for the DOJ's Civil Asset Division. I saw what you did yesterday. You've started something you can't undo." He looked at her, puzzled. "Then why are you warning me?" She hesitated. "Because I lost people who asked the same questions." Before he could respond, the elevator opened and she was gone. Inside the chamber, part 2 of the hearing began. But something was different. The justices sat straighter. Their questions were sharper, more curious than confrontational. And Denzel? He didn't come to argue. He came to reveal. Using a series of case studies, he laid bare the human cost of unchecked forfeiture. Single mothers who lost homes, veterans stripped of cars, immigrant families ruined by raids based only on suspicion. He closed with one line. The Constitution isn't a suggestion, it's a promise, and it's time we keep it. The room was silent. Roberts leaned forward. "Mr. Washington," he said, "are you suggesting we reverse decades of precedent on your testimony alone?" Denzel didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor. I'm asking you to look out that window, at the people who trusted you to protect them, and ask if you still recognize their faces." The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to, because in that moment, the highest court in the land was listening, not to a lawyer or an actor, but to a citizen demanding justice. The corridors of the Supreme Court buzzed with a tension rarely felt in its marbled halls. Behind closed doors, debates raged, not just legal debates, but personal reckonings. Some justices clung to tradition, others were shaken by what they had heard. But one thing was certain. The courtroom had changed after Denzel Washington stepped inside. It was supposed to be a symbolic hearing, a formality. Now, it was a battleground for the Constitution itself. Chief Justice Roberts sat at the head of the long, polished oak conference table. Around him, 8 justices, each with folders thick with case law, ethics memos, and public reaction. The media frenzy outside was unprecedented. Protests, rallies, even international coverage. People weren't just watching, they were choosing sides. "We were never meant to vote," one justice whispered, "but here we are." And there was Roberts. Silent. He had reviewed every page of Denzel's citations, personally rechecked the precedents, and he couldn't deny it anymore. Not legally, and certainly not morally. Meanwhile, Denzel sat at a diner just 2 blocks away, barely touching his coffee. He was alone, not for security, but for clarity. He stared out the window, watching people walk past, unaware of the storm he'd ignited. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. "It's happening," the voice said. "They're actually going to vote." He froze. They weren't supposed to. That wasn't the plan. This was just supposed to spark a discussion, maybe a shift in public narrative. But now it was real. Back at the court, one by one, justices spoke. Some argued this would unleash chaos on law enforcement. Others said the chaos already existed, just not for people who looked like them. Then came Roberts. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. "For too long," he said, "we've confused silence for order. But order without justice isn't peace. It's oppression. I vote in favor of reform." A hush fell. Then slowly, more votes followed. When the final count was read aloud, it wasn't close. 6-3 in favor of restricting the government's power in civil forfeiture cases. Denzel didn't cheer. He didn't even smile. He just exhaled and finally took a sip of that cold coffee. That night, America changed. Quietly, legally, powerfully. And for the first time in a long time, people believed the system might still be capable of hearing them. When the decision dropped, it didn't come with fanfare. No confetti, no champagne, just one notification after another, lighting up screens across the country. Washington versus United States. Decision rendered 6-3. Civil forfeiture, powers restricted. Precedent shift. Historic. The system had blinked, and the whole world noticed. The next morning, Denzel Washington walked into the National Archives. Not for press, not for politics, but for perspective. He stood silently in front of the original Constitution, glass separating him from parchment, the very document he'd just used to shift the tectonic plates of American law. "You didn't write this for men like me back then," he whispered. "But today, I made you listen." He turned and left without speaking to anyone else. Meanwhile, in legal offices from coast to coast, the ruling sent shockwaves. Defense attorneys filed immediate motions to return millions in seized property. District attorneys scrambled to update guidelines. And law enforcement agencies across 14 states halted ongoing forfeiture procedures overnight. For some, it was chaos. For others, it was justice. And for many, it was both. Cable news spun the ruling every which way. Was Denzel a hero, an activist, a celebrity stepping out of line? Or, as some finally admitted, the unexpected voice the court desperately needed? Chief Justice Roberts, for once, refused interviews. But a leaked internal memo, later published by The Atlantic, revealed a chilling sentence in his handwriting. "What scares me is not that he was right, but that we had to be reminded." Outside the Supreme Court, people gathered with candles and signs. One simply read, "Thank you, Counselor Washington." And then, silence. Because Denzel disappeared. No press tour, no follow-up speech, no book deal. He returned to his quiet life, to film sets, to family, to a life where he didn't need headlines to feel heard. But something had changed forever. In classrooms, students studied the case. In communities, families talked about what had been taken and what could now be returned. And in the highest courts, judges whispered the name Washington, not just as an actor, but as a constitutional force. Because sometimes the most powerful revolution isn't waged with banners or bullets. Sometimes it walks into a courtroom in a tailored suit, armed with nothing but facts, courage, and a quiet, unshakable belief in what's right. And when the system blinks, that's when the people finally open their eyes.